2018, a 21-year-old brand new police officer named Derek was dumped by his longtime girlfriend. This breakup caught him by surprise because he had actually just recently moved to Colorado in order to be closer to his girlfriend. So naturally, he was devastated. After a few weeks of being so depressed and kind of just moping around and going through the motions in his life at this point, one of his very close friends suggested to him, like, hey man, look, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating service, and just put yourself out there again. You have no idea who's out there. Clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one. Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. So online dating was definitely not on his radar. But he was so lonely and sad, he figured, you know what? I got nothing to lose. And so he made himself a Tinder profile. Derek quickly matched with a woman on Tinder named Leah that he said was way out of his league, but he wasn't complaining. They chatted for a couple of weeks and they got on great. And so they wanted to get together and actually meet each other in person. But Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek, so there wasn't a natural meeting place. And they're going back and forth about where they want to go. And finally, Leah just says, hey, why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time, and they have this awesome field that's on a slope, and you can lay on it and look up through the trees and you can see the stars. And so that would be a cool thing to do on our first date, go stargazing together. So the date night finally came, and Derek was really excited. He was nervous too, because even though they talked on the phone, this is the first time they're going to see each other. And so the plan was he was going to drive out to her town and actually pick her up from her work. She worked at a hair salon, and from there they would make their way over to this park. And so Derek pulls up to the hair salon right as Leah is coming outside, and she's all excited and she's waving to him. She runs over and she gets in the car and they hug and kiss on the cheek. And it's like they knew each other, but they didn't know each other because their entire relationship was online or, via texting or a phone call. And so it's like they had history, but they didn't. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to this access road that was going to bring them into this park. And when Leah told him to make this turn, it didn't look like a very well marked trail or even a marked park. It looked like this kind of random access road that Derek would not have associated with a big public park, but he doesn't know the area. And so he turns and he starts heading down this road, and the road went from cement to dirt pretty quickly. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, did I take a wrong turn? Does she know like where she's going? This does not feel like the way you drive into a big park, the way she was describing. Finally, they land back on cement, and they're actually on this road that's right up against this huge field. And so right away, Derek's stress is gone because now it's confirmed in his mind that, okay, that's a weird way to get into this park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and we're back on a real road, and everything's good again. Derek asked Leah, where should I park? Because they're on this really narrow road, and there didn't appear to be a parking lot. There also didn't appear to be anybody else on this field or on this road. It's this huge, open, beautiful space, but it did not look well populated or like it was well traveled. But she said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. And so Derek starts going up this road, and he sees maybe 300 feet ahead of him are dim headlights of another car making their way down the road towards him. And now it was dark enough that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. And so he didn't know if it was going to be some big truck or something like that. And so what he did is he just pulled over as far to the side of the road as he could to allow this vehicle to pass, even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they were passing him. He figured just give them the right of the road. And so as they start moving forward, he can see that it's actually this big van, and they're moving pretty slowly, and he's just kind of waiting for them to pass, and he's not thinking anything of this. He's thinking that this is just another person at the park. And this van, instead of passing him, actually turns at the last second and almost goes bumper to bumper with Derek's car. He doesn't crash into it, but he stops just in front of Derek's car. And so Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop, and he's super aggressive. He really believes in his training. And so as soon as this guy stopped in front of him and blocked the path for him, red flags are going up for Derek, and he knows something's wrong with this van. And instinctively, he says, Leah, stay here. He grabs his flashlight that he kept right in the center console, and he jumped out of the car and went right to the driver's side door of this van to confront this guy. And when he got up to the driver's side door, it was this really big guy who looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to him with his flashlight. And Derek's like, what are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for? And the guy's like, oh, hey, sorry, I'm the caretaker here of this whole property, and we've had an issue with poachers in the area, and I was concerned you guys were poachers. It doesn't look like you're poachers, though. And Derek's like, no, we're not poachers. We're going stargazing. I'm on my first date here. And the caretaker's like, I am so sorry. Please get back in your car, go and enjoy your night. And at that, he backed up, did a 3-point turn, and drove right back up that road where he came from and disappeared down on the other side of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, making sure this guy was gone. And then he turned around and he got back in the car and he kind of joked with Leah. And he's like, yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him. And that's why he stopped us. But when he looked over at Leah to react to his hilarious joke, she wasn't paying attention to him. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, which Derek did think was a little bit odd. You'd think that she'd be more interested in this strange thing that just happened. Some weird guy just blocked us in and I'm confronting him. You'd think she'd be interested in that on some level. She might want to know what I said to the guy and what he said to me, but she didn't seem to care. She was just really invested in whoever she was typing on her phone. And so Derek thinks, whatever, and just throws the car back in drive and continues up the trail the way they were going before they were stopped. So Derek continues down the road just a little ways until he sees a little dirt lot that's butted up against this huge field they're going to be hanging out on for the night. And so he pulls into the lot, backs into his space, and he and Leah get out and they put a blanket out right next to the car, but on the grass on the hill. And they get their food out and their wine out and they sit down and very quickly they start swapping stories and they're laughing and they're stargazing and they're having some wine and everything's really great. After about an hour, it's totally dark outside and Derek is laying on the hill facing back towards his car and towards the road they were on. And he notices to his left up at the top of the hill, so the same area where the van had come from originally and where it went back to after they spoke that one time. Derek is looking out there and he sees headlights and it's the van. And now the van is driving down the road, not leisurely like it was before, but they are flying down the hill. And before Derek or Leah have a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it comes flying into the parking lot and practically hits his car and comes to a stop where it's boxed his car in. So even if he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. And so Derek jumps up, Leah jumps up, and the guy, the caretaker, the nice caretaker he talked to before, he hops out of the driver's seat and he walks around the front of the van. He's got this pipe in his hand and he looks at Derek and he's like, give me your keys and your wallet. And again, Derek is this brand new cop. He's 21 years old. He's not about to let this guy push him around. And so he doesn't do anything at first. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he doesn't do anything at first. He just looks at this guy and he shows him that I'm not just going to fall over because he told me to. But then Derek is given a huge curveball when Leah, his date, stands up and runs over to this guy and stands next to him and turns around and looks at Derek and goes, come on, give us your keys and wallet. And Derek's like, great, I'm getting set up by my date who I've spent the past 2 hours with, I had a connection with this girl. And so now Derek is just standing there doing nothing, not to be tough, but because he's in shock. He feels so betrayed by Leah, and he just feels like, how could this have happened? And in that moment, Leah walks to the back of the van, and she gets a metal pipe. She comes back around, and she goes, Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you. And this is when Derek looks at them both, and he goes, no. And as soon as he said that, the big guy tackles him. He gets thrown to the ground, but Derek could handle himself, and very quickly he was able to get up, and he drew his concealed carry pistol, and he's aiming it at the big guy and then back at Leah, and he's like, yeah, I'm a cop. Go ahead and put your hands up now. As soon as they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and put their hands up. And so as he's holding them both at gunpoint, and he's looking over at Leah like, really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now? As he's doing that, he has to get his cell phone out of his pocket, type in 911, and then called dispatch and had to say who he was, what his badge number was, what happened, and where he is. And where he is was difficult to describe. And so as he's trying to explain these directions, and he's saying, yep, go left at the light, and then there's a gas station there, and you're gonna go up this field, you're gonna see me, I got these two people at gunpoint. As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other, and they just turn around and bolt. They figure he's distracted, we can at least get behind the van and run into the forest before he's going to catch us. And so instinctively, he takes off running after them, and he chases them for about 30 seconds into the tree line before he starts hearing gunshots. And they weren't his, someone's shooting at him, and he sees the muzzle flash out in the middle of the forest, and he's like, yeah, I'm not doing this. He turns around, runs back to his vehicle, he starts it up, and he has to basically smash into the van, back into the fence over and over again like Austin Powers, like a 25-point turn before he was barely able to grind his way out and peel out of this park. And so Derek pulls into the nearest gas station. He calls up dispatch and he says, hey, I just called 911 like 5-10 minutes ago and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody here's my name, here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now? And they said, yep, we'll send some to you. And so a police cruiser shows up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him, and they got out, and he explained again what happened, and they kind of gave him a hard time for getting catfished on his very first date. But at the same time, they knew it could have gone really badly. And so they decide they're going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park. And so they get up to the park, and Derek points ahead and he goes, that's the van, it's still here. And so they drive up and they stop short of the van. And the 2 uniformed officers, they turn to Derek and they're like, just stay in here, we're going to go check this van out. And so Derek's sitting in the car watching these guys go up to the vehicle, guns drawn. They're looking all around, they're clearing behind the vehicle, they're looking in the wood line. There's nobody there. And at some point he sees them put their pistols away and they go in the van. They're kind of shining with their flashlights all around. They're looking in the back, looking in the front. And then after a few minutes, they walk back to the cruiser. And as soon as they got in, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him. Now, whatever they had seen in the van was definitely not something they were going to joke about. And they turned to him and they're like, the back of the van, it was just knives and saws and pistols and rifles and lighter fluid and chains and handcuffs and duct tape. It was just awful, and it looks like there might even be blood on the ground. The 2 officers immediately called in additional backup, and before long, it was a full-fledged circus around this van of a crime scene investigation unit and other police officers, spotlights set up, and they went out looking in the woods for these people, but they never found the guy, they never found the girl, and Derek would tell the other investigators, hey, she works at this hair salon, like right down the road, I picked her up there. And so they went over to the hair salon and they wound up talking to the people there and they said, we've never heard of Leah. And when they showed them a picture of Leah, they were like, we've never seen her before. And so they came back and they told Derek, look, she's a con artist. And this whole thing, your whole relationship with her has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing. That's all it ever was. And so for Derek, that was crushing. And he swore off Tinder immediately. He did not want to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him more than just being taken advantage of is, what would have happened if I wasn't concealed carrying? Would I have wound up in the back of that van? In the summer of 2019, a grandmother named Barbara was looking after her grandkids for the weekend while her daughter and her husband were out of town. Her daughter had 3 kids, 2 that were under the age of 6 and 1 who was 15 years old, and her name was Alyssa. And so anytime Barbara was looking after her grandkids for longer than just a single day, like if she was taking care of them overnight, she would just stay at their house so as not to disrupt their lives more than she needed to. And so their house was a modest single-story home in a nice suburb of Dallas, Texas, where the crime rate is basically 0. And everybody in the neighborhood knows each other. And so this particular night that she's over there looking after them was like any other. She put the 2 young ones to bed first, and then she and Alyssa stayed up a little bit later in the kitchen chatting, talking about school, before ultimately both of them went to bed. So because their house is a single-story home, all the bedrooms are on the only floor of the house. And so Barbara and Alyssa's room were right next to each other, looking out to the side of the property. And so as soon as Barbara got in her room, she opened up the window that was right next to her bed, because as a kid, she always slept with the window open. And even though her daughter's house had air conditioning, she preferred to keep the window open. So window's open, she has a screen that's in her window, and Barbara crawls into bed and she falls asleep. At about 3 a.m., Barbara wakes up to the sound of rustling coming from outside of her window. And so she hears it, but it sounds an awful lot like it's probably just a dog or a cat or some other animal that's in the area. It did not seem like a big deal to her, and she was just going to forget about it. But then she heard it again, and it sounded much more like footsteps, and they sounded heavy enough that it probably couldn't be a dog or a cat. And so she rolled over onto her elbows and she pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out the screen door. And so the moon was out, so there was pretty good illumination, and so she could clearly see the side of the house. She could see the side of the house, she could see the fence that separated their property and their neighbors, and then she could see the neighbor's house and all their lights are off. And she noticed propped up against the fence on their side of the fence, so on their property, was this bike that she didn't recognize. And she's looking at it thinking, is that Alyssa's bike? It's too big to be either of the 6-year-old's bikes. Whose bike is that? And as she's looking at the bike, she hears more rustling coming from the left, which is closer to Alyssa's room. Barbara presses her face up against the screen to try to look out the window towards the left, because whatever's making the sound is now out of her view. And as she's got her face pressed up against the screen trying to look, she sees a boy emerge from the bushes from right underneath Alyssa's room. He's got that high school Letterman jacket, like the classic, football jacket that high school kids wear. He comes out of the bushes wearing that, and he's got his hood pulled up, and he doesn't look over at her. He's just backing up away from Alyssa's room, and he's looking up into Alyssa's room. And so Barbara immediately thinks, okay, this guy is probably one of Alyssa's friends, maybe a boyfriend, I don't know. And Alyssa must have invited him over. Maybe she invited him when she knew her parents were going to be out of town, but before I said I was going to be here to look after them, and that message didn't get passed to him, and so he's here. All these scenarios are going through Barbara's head, but all she knew is she's not going to call the cops on some teenage kid that's coming to say hi to Alyssa. Instead, she's going to confront him, because Barbara was actually a high school teacher and had been for decades. And so she'd had lots of run-ins with badly behaved teenagers, and she was pretty good at standing her ground and being firm and kind of getting teenagers to listen to her. So she figured she would just go out there and be stern with him, and he'd get the message. And so she quietly gets off of her bed. She walks out of her room to the front of the house. So he's over here, side of the house. She's going to the front of the house. She flips on the lights as soon as she's outside, and she quickly walks around to the edge of the porch where she can poke her head over and see right down the side of the house where this kid's going to be. So she pokes her head over and she goes, "Can I help you?" And this kid turns and looks at her for the first time, and immediately Barbara's like, oh, whoa. He is not a teenager. He looks like he's in his 20s, if not 30s. No matter what, he is a lot older than Alyssa. And it caught her so off guard, she didn't really know how to react to it. She was just looking at this guy who looks so much older, but he's got a bike, and he's wearing a Letterman jacket. And so Barbara's a little bit confused. And so she's thinking to herself, okay, it's possible that he could just be one of those kids that looks a lot older than he really is. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she's thinking, this doesn't feel right. This feels like a grown man is trying to get into the house. And so as she's thinking about this, she's also registering that this guy, he seems completely unfazed. He's just looking up at her, and he actually starts taking steps towards her to the point where Barbara says, stop where you are. And he does. And he looks up at her and he says, "I'm looking for Alyssa. Is she home?" And so as Barbara is just glaring at this guy, hoping that will be enough to get him to leave, but he's not leaving, it occurs to her that this could be a misunderstanding. And so thinking on her feet, she says to him, "Who did you say you're looking for? Lisa?" Without any hesitation, he goes, "No, I'm looking for Alyssa McCarran. She lives here." Barbara went silent for a second because he was right. That was her name, and she certainly was here. But she did not want him coming anywhere near the house until she had a chance to talk to Alyssa and confirm that she had invited him here, or at the very minimum, that she knew who he was. And so Barbara says to the guy, "I need you to stay right there. It's 3 a.m. I don't know you. Give me a minute. I'll be right back." And he appears to get the message. And so Barbara went back inside the house. She shut and locked the door behind her. And then she went into Alyssa's room and she shook her foot to wake her up. And so Alyssa kind of sits up and she's looking around and she's like, "What's going on?" And Barbara looks at her and she's kind of annoyed with how the night's gone. And at this point, she's kind of blaming Alyssa for probably having invited this strange creep over to their house in the middle of the night. And she says to Alyssa, "Did you invite a boy here tonight?" And Alyssa's like, "No, what are you talking about?" Barbara narrowed her eyes and she said, "Well, there's a boy outside that clearly knows you. He asked for you by name, and he knows you live here, and he's outside right now. Can you please go out there and tell him that coming over unannounced at 3 a.m. is not very polite, and he shouldn't do it again?" Alyssa's confused, and she's looking at her grandmother like, "What are you talking about?" And so she leans back and she opens the curtain of her window, and she looks outside, and immediately she pulls her head back in, and she says, "Grandma, he asked for me by name?" And Barbara's like, "Yeah, he said Alyssa McCarran lives here." And Alyssa's like, "We have to call 911. I've never seen him before in my life." Suddenly, everything made sense for Barbara. This was a stranger. This is not a friend. This is probably a grown man, and he was probably trying to break into Alyssa's room. And so as she's having this realization, they both hear footsteps out on the front porch. And at this, Barbara goes into full protective grandmother mode, and she tells Alyssa, "Stay in your bed, do not move." And Barbara runs out of her room. She goes into her bedroom, and she shuts that window and locks it, and then runs to the front of the house to make sure that door was locked, because she thought she locked it when she came in, but she wasn't 100% sure. She gets right in front of it, and she can see that it's locked. And now she's standing right on the other side of the door, kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. And this guy is standing on the porch, but obscured. She can't see him because he's on the other side of the door. And it's silent for a second. And as she's standing there just waiting for something to happen, she hears knocking on the door. And it startled her when she heard it, and she yelled out, "There's no Alyssa McCarran here. You have the wrong house. You need to leave or I'm calling the police." And the knocking stops for a second, and he says, I know Alyssa lives here. Tell her to come outside. He goes back to knocking and Barbara picks up her phone and she calls 911 and she intentionally talks really loudly into the phone, making it very obvious she is calling the police. And very clearly this guy picked up on what Barbara was doing because the knocking stopped and she saw him through the little slit of glass next to the door run to the left of the house back towards the side where his bike was. And so Barbara, while on the phone, runs into the bedroom where she was sleeping and she looks out the side window and the last she sees of this guy is riding his bike across the street. And then he stops next to an SUV and he opens a trunk and he throws the bike in the trunk and he gets in the passenger side of the car and they drive off, which means whatever he had planned to do with Alyssa or whatever he was doing this night, he had an accomplice. The police show up a couple minutes later, and at this point, this creep and whoever he was with are long gone, but Barbara still gives her description of the vehicle and description of the night and what happened, and the police told her that over the past couple of weeks, they've gotten very similar reports from other households where there are young girls inside of the house. Apparently, this boy was actually a grown man that would use social media to figure out where kids lived, and then he would dress up like a teenager, and then he would go stalk them. And so whatever Alyssa had listed online, he had been able to deduce that she lived there, and who knows how long he had been looking in the window at her at night. In 2018, an up-and-coming Instagram influencer named Wendy was contacted by a hotel in Miami, Florida that wanted to see if she'd be willing to stay at their property over Memorial Day weekend. They said they were willing to cover all of her expenses as long as she was willing to post a couple of times while she was at the hotel showing off how great the hotel was. They also told her to bring along a female friend and that friend they would cover all of her expenses as well. Even though Wendy didn't know if she had any girl friends that would want to do this with her, she was so eager to take them up on this opportunity because she was trying to make being an influencer be her full-time job. And so opportunities like this were huge for her. And so she said yes, even before she knew if she could bring along a friend like they asked her to. And so sure enough, over the next couple of days, as she reached out to her network to see if there's any females that wanted to come with her, everybody was either busy or wasn't that interested or they had plans. And so since she did not want to cancel, she thought, well, it can't be that big of a deal if I bring along a male friend. And so she reached out to her good friend Mitch, who's this 6'4" athletic guy who was just one of her close friends. And she said, hey, would you mind coming along with me to this thing in Miami over Memorial Day weekend? I need someone to go with me. They asked for a female, but you're going to have to do. And so Mitch agreed to do it. And Wendy thought to herself, well, worst case scenario is they're not willing to pay for Mitch's, expenses and that she would pay for them. And she told Mitch as much. And so they thought that was just fine. They figured that was a good solution. And so the day arrives and Wendy and Mitch are really excited about this trip. They don't often get to go travel around as influencers. And so they hop on a plane, they fly first class to Miami. When they get there, they go down, they get their bags at a baggage claim, and then they go out to the curb, and right away, Wendy sees there's this really well-dressed guy with dark sunglasses on, and he's holding up a sign that has her last name on it and the logo of the hotel on it. And so she waves to him and walks over, and Mitch is following right behind, and this guy looks at her and he says, okay, well, where's your friend? And that's when she says, oh, well, actually, I brought Mitch because none of my girlfriends wanted to go, so I brought Mitch along. And so this guy lowers his sunglasses and he looks at Mitch and he kind of looks up and down. Then he puts his sunglasses back and he turns and he walks towards this beautiful black SUV that's parked right up against the curb. And so Wendy and Mitch follow him, and this guy opens up the back door and Wendy and Mitch get in. The guy takes their luggage and puts it in the back of the vehicle and shuts it. And as soon as Wendy and Mitch sit inside of this car, the driver is visibly upset. He's kind of ranting and raving, and the front passenger window was down. And so Wendy and Mitch assumed he must be yelling at someone outside of the vehicle, like this guy that had just picked them up. He must be communicating with him somehow. He can't possibly be yelling at us. We just got here. We don't know him. But sure enough, as they kind of are tuning into what he's saying, he has a very thick accent, and he's saying, where is the other girl? You're not supposed to have a guy. It's two girls. Not one girl, one guy. It's two girls. Where is the other girl? As Wendy is hearing this, she feels so uncomfortable, not just for herself, but for Mitch too, because she asked him to come along and had said, oh, it won't be a big deal. They won't mind. But clearly they do mind. And so Wendy's trying to explain to the driver that I know you asked for a female friend, but I didn't have a female friend. And so I brought him along. I will pay for him. I'm not asking you guys to pay for him. I'll pay for everything that he touches. I'll pay for his hotel, his flight, everything. But the driver didn't seem that upset about who was paying for Mitch. His frustration came from a place of being frustrated, like they weren't going to be able to do whatever they had planned to do because now Mitch is in the mix. And so as Wendy and the driver are kind of going back and forth and the driver's getting more and more frustrated, the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch hopped in the front seat and he and the driver started arguing with each other in Portuguese. And so for about a minute, Wendy and Mitch are looking at each other like, what is going on here? And these guys are yelling at each other and then they stop and the driver turns around again and one more time he says to Wendy, "Where is the other girl?" And Wendy says, "There is no other girl. It is Mitch and I. That is it." At this point, the driver makes a sound like he was disgusted with both of them and he raises his hand up like this and he turns to face the road in front of him. And the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch, he gets out of the passenger seat, goes around to the back, opens the back of the truck, takes their luggage out, throws it onto the curb, goes to the door that is closest to Mitch, opens it up, and he tells them to get out. And so Wendy and Mitch climb back out onto the curb. The guy shuts the door behind them. He hops back in the front seat, and that car peels away. That was it. At this point, Wendy's thinking to herself, I bet those two guys have nothing to do with the hotel and the people that I had been communicating with to set this whole thing up. I bet they are just the drivers, and they were told to pick up two girls, and we showed up with a girl and a guy, and it screwed them up, and they got mad, and they got really mad, I guess, and then they left. And so I bet if I can just get in touch with the people at the hotel, the people I had spoken to, that they can clear this whole thing up. And so she opens up her email and she sends a message to Marissa, who was one of the people at the hotel that she had been going back and forth with when she was buying her plane ticket. And then she sent another message to the Instagram account that had over 10,000 followers that she had been going back and forth with quite a bit that had actually originally reached out to her. And so for a couple of minutes, Wendy is watching her phone, waiting for a response. And at some point, Mitch says to her, by the time we get a response to either your, Instagram DM or your email, we probably could have just taken an Uber over to the hotel and spoken to them directly. So why don't we just go do that? And so they agree, they hop in an Uber and they drive the short distance to this hotel. And as soon as they get out, Wendy notices something that at the time did not seem like a big deal, which was the logo of the hotel, the one in real life right in front of her. It was a little bit different than the one that is on the Instagram page, the one she'd been talking back and forth with. That was their profile picture. It's different than the one in real life. And so that stood out to her just because she had looked at that page a number of times. But it was definitely the same hotel, and so she didn't think much of it. And she and Mitch walked inside right up to the front desk, and Wendy asked to speak with a manager. And shortly thereafter, a manager comes out and she asks Wendy and Mitch to come into her office. They go inside and she says, "Okay guys, what's going on? What do you need?" And so Wendy explains the framework of the deal she had negotiated with Marissa. And she said, "Look, when I got to the airport, the guys that picked us up were incredibly rude and they wouldn't give us a ride here. And I just want to let you know what happened. We don't care. We got a ride here, but we just figured you should know." And the woman looks at her kind of puzzled and she says, "Who was the person you talked to? You said Marissa?" And Wendy's like, "Yeah, Marissa. She's the marketing person here." And the manager looks at her and she says, "No, I'm the marketing person and my name's Kelly. I think you're at the wrong hotel, because we don't have any influencers that are here right now, and I would have known about this." Wendy can't believe it, and she pulls up the Instagram page she's been talking to, and she shows it to the manager. And the manager takes it, and she's pretty surprised by what she's looking at, and she's like, "This is our old account. We deleted this, or I thought we deleted this. We have a new one because we rebranded. We have a brand new logo, everything's new, and we just felt like we'd start fresh. So I don't know who owns this account now, but that is our account. It's just we don't use it anymore. I don't know how anyone got a hold of it." At this point, it clicked for Wendy that this whole thing was a facade, that this whole time she was being conned, and what really scared her is, to what end? What were they trying to do with her? Had she shown up with the other female friend, what would they have done with her? But at this moment, Wendy just feels totally overwhelmed by the entire moment. She's so embarrassed that she thought this was real, and she dragged Mitch along, and this whole thing was just fake. She's so embarrassed that she just approached this manager who basically said, "That's all fake." And so she just wanted to leave. And so she stands up and she says, "I'm really sorry for wasting your time," to the manager, and she and Mitch leave. She goes outside and she just sits down and she's crying. And Mitch says, "Hey, you really ought to call the police and let them know this happened because, clearly there were plans for you and, had you brought a female friend, and they can't have been good plans. I think you need to let the police know that this scam exists. And so Wendy does call the police and she explains what happened, and she's surprised when they say, hey, where are you right now? We'd love to send a detective over to you to talk to you a little bit more about what happened. And so Wendy tells them where they are, and she's a little bit surprised that they want to send a detective over to talk about this, because in her mind, this isn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's a big deal to her and to Mitch, but nothing really happened. But either way, they go sit on the bench right outside the hotel and they wait for the detective to show up. And just a couple of minutes later, he does. He walks up, he introduces himself, and he says, hey, let's go inside and grab a table and we can chat. And so they go inside and they sit down, and Wendy and Mitch go over their story one more time. And after they're done, the detective says, look, I don't mean to scare you, but I do want you to understand just how serious of a situation you guys were just in. So in Miami, human traffickers use these phony hotel Instagram accounts to attract young women like yourself to Miami in order to be trafficked. And so they will buy these old business Instagram accounts from companies that have either rebranded or who are going out of business. They'll pay top dollar to acquire those Instagram accounts. And then they will use them in order to get people like you to come to Miami. And so probably the only reason they didn't follow through on their operation is because you brought Mitch along, who posed a threat to them. And so that's why they were upset with you, and that's why they decided it wasn't worth it. So even though this must have been incredibly traumatic for you, I'm sure you were spared a much worse fate. Night 2010, 2-year-old Rowan Griffin was in the backseat of the car next to his 2 older siblings, and his father was driving the car. And they were on their way to this big family party at Rowan's grandparents' house. They lived in Richmond, New Hampshire, which is a pretty rural part of New Hampshire, and their house was literally in the woods. You had to go down this really long driveway to get to it, and it was this single-story home where they had cleared out all the trees in the backyard to kind of clear a space to have these awesome cookouts for family get-togethers. And so Rowan, his 2 siblings, and his dad, they get to the entrance of the driveway that's going to bring them up to the house, and they can already tell there's tons of people here because there's cars lining the driveway all the way out to the street. And so they make their way up the driveway, and sure enough, right in the backyard is just a sea of adults and teenagers and kids. It's this huge family reunion, and Rowan and his 2 siblings just take off running to go play with their cousins. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids were just running around having a great time, and the adults are having a good time. And at some point, the adults started to notice, after the fact, they would say they noticed this, they started to notice Rowan was chasing a cat. There was a cat that lived at the grandparents' house, and he loved the cat, and he was chasing it all around the backyard. And at some point, Rowan ran into the woods to chase after this cat. And a number of adults saw him do that, but it was like mob mentality, where they each thought somebody else was watching Rowan. They were not trying to be negligent. They just figured there's so many people here, what can go wrong? In a very short period of time, Mr. Griffin realizes he can't find his son. And so he goes to the kids and he's like, hey, have you seen Rowan? And they're like, oh yeah, I think he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And then Mr. Griffin asks the adults and they say the same thing. Yeah, he's chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And after looking around for him and everybody basically saying he was chasing this cat and not being able to find him, he just started yelling to the group, hey, everybody stop for a second. I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he's chasing a cat. Well, then can you tell me where he went? I don't know where he is. And pretty quickly they realize he's not in the house. He's not in the backyard. He's not at the end of the driveway. He's not in any of the cars. He's not here. And very quickly, the group started yelling for Rowan. They're running out into the woods. They're looking for him. And Mr. Griffin is like, I don't know how long he's been gone for. And so he calls 911 right then and there. He's not taking any chances. And so the police come out and they launch this huge search. And then all these locals in the area that had ATVs and 4-wheelers, they came out and they're driving around the forest looking for Rowan. Everybody's yelling for him. There's hundreds of people out there. But as the sun started to fade, they still hadn't found him. They had found no indication of where he went. They assumed he made it out into the forest because the last sign of him was he was chasing a cat into the forest potentially, but they really didn't know. And so finally the sun does go down that night and they have to postpone the search until first light the next morning. And you can only imagine how horrible that was for Rowan's parents as they're sitting inside that night wondering what's happening to their 2-year-old son who's just out in the woods by himself. So very early the next morning, a whole bunch of volunteers went right back out into the woods to look for Rowan. There was this one particular group that wanted to look a little bit farther away than where everybody else was looking. They were going to be about 3+ miles away in this swamp. And so this group of searchers, they start walking into this swamp and they can tell right away that it's a very wet and deep swamp. They would take a step onto something that looked solid and they would sink 2-3 feet into the water. They all had waders on so they wouldn't get wet. But they were basically sludging through the swamp, and it was very thick. And at some point, they make their way through a clearing, and they see on a log what looks like a pair of children's shoes, or shoes for sure. They look small enough to be kids. And so they wade their way over, and they climb up onto this dry section of land, and they walk over, and sure enough, they're kids' shoes. And so they yell out for him a couple times, and they stop to listen. And after a minute, they hear him call back. He's yelling, "Here!" And they walk their way past this huge bush, and they look through, and they can't believe it. They see Rowan right in the middle of this bog of water. There is a tree that is right in the middle of this, and he's clutched onto the tree. He looks dry, he looks okay, and he's just standing on this island holding this tree. And so immediately the searchers jump right in the water, and they start wading their way out to this island where Rowan is. And the whole time they're going out there, the water's, up to their chest, and they're looking around, and it's at least that deep all the way around this thing. And they're looking up at the kid, and he's bone dry, and he's 2 years old. So they don't know if he knows how to swim or not. And so they're thinking to themselves, how did he get out here? But either way, they're like, let's just get the kid and bring him back to his parents. And so they finally hop up onto this island, and they kind of look over Rowan. He seems okay. They pick him up, and they keep him out of the water, and they bring him back to land and back to his parents. Initially, Rowan's parents and the police and the searchers, everybody is just so happy that Rowan is alive that no one is asking any questions about, what happened and, what's the deal with you being found on that island? How'd you get out there? People are just leaving it alone. They're just happy he's here. But after the dust had settled, so to speak, Rowan's parents would ask him some questions. They would say, what happened? How'd you get lost? And how'd you get on that island? And at first, Rowan was just not saying anything, but eventually he would say that there were cows out there. And he said that he was scared of the cows, and that's why he went to the island, because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, there were no cows in that swamp or anywhere near where he was that night. So either he didn't see anything and he was hallucinating seeing animals at all, or he was mislabeling something else that he was seeing. But whatever he was seeing or believed he was seeing, it scared the heck out of him, and he would get really frightened when he would talk about these cows. But regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question is, how did he get out to that island? Because in order to get out to that island, for him, being a 2-year-old, being the size he was, he would have had to swim. The water was too deep all the way around the island, and he didn't know how to swim. But even if he had found a way to magically swim out to this island, why wasn't he wet? It's also worth noting this all took place just a few miles away from the infamous Bennington Triangle, which is this area in southern Vermont where there's been a whole string of people going missing under very mysterious circumstances. In 1953, 11-year-old Jerry Monkman was considered a very frail child. He was skinnier than his peers, he was shorter than his peers, and he had a really bad case of asthma, which was a breathing condition that made doing anything physical really difficult. But despite his perceived fragility, he loved going outside, he loved hiking, and he was a proud member of the Boy Scouts. And so on April 25th of that year, Jerry was really excited when he found out his Boy Scout troop was offering a trip to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for a weekend, and he jumped at the opportunity. So Jerry, his troop, and his troop leaders, they all pile in a van and they make their way up to the Rocky Mountains, and as soon as they get there, they go on this wickedly rugged hike up in the Teton Canyon, and about an hour into their trip, one of the troop leaders turns around and Jerry's gone. The troop leaders did not know how long he had been gone for, so they only searched for a couple of minutes before one of them ran down the mountain to try to get help. Soon the sheriff's department arrived, and 1,600 volunteers from the town that had heard about this, they all poured out onto the mountain, and they are combing across this mountain to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours, they couldn't find him, and people started to think the worst. And then just then, the bloodhound they had brought out to try to track his scent picked up Jerry's scent, and it starts taking off up the trail. And the handler of the dog tells everyone, hey, he's picked him up. We're going to find him. We're going to find him. And he thinks the dog's going to lead him to him, within a mile or so of where they are. But the dog just stays on a complete beeline for 6 hours. It just tracks straight north for 6 hours until it comes to this big swamp where it stops. Like, I found it. This is where it ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. So the handler and the people that had followed this dog, they searched the swamp because even though they thought it was totally improbable that Jerry, this frail 11-year-old with asthma, would have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through rugged terrain to the swamp, they still felt like they needed to search it. So they searched the swamp, there wasn't anything there. And so the dog handler's thinking, okay, my dog must have made a mistake. And so he gives the scent again to the dog, thinking the dog will turn and start heading back towards where Jerry had gone missing. But instead, his dog basically just reconfirms that, nope, this is where the scent brought me. I'm still right. And so the dog handler and everybody else that had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just decided that the dog must have made a mistake and the kid could never have been here. The next morning at 8 a.m., an 8-year-old boy named David was riding his horse about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. And he happened to be looking over at the tree line, and a boy stumbles out of the tree line and waves to him. And so David goes over, and it turns out it's Jerry Monkman. Jerry would just tell David that he needs to get back to his group. And David would say, what are you doing out here? And Jerry just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday and I need to get back to them. And apparently David asked him, well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the searchers that they had found Jerry and they had found him 30 miles away, they couldn't believe it. The day before, it had been unbelievable that he could have traveled 12 miles to that swamp. Like literally unbelievable. They didn't believe it. Nope, he couldn't have done it. And now clearly he's traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was found. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies, meaning overhead air miles, 30 miles. The reality is when you're walking in the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines. You make turns and you go left, there's switchbacks, and the area he must have gone through over those 30 miles is all unmarked. It's this rugged, hilly, awful, unmarked terrain. So for sure, he probably covered 40 plus miles to get there. And so the police asked him, how did you do this? How did you cover the distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would say he just remembers sleeping under a tree and then waking up, and he would see animals poking their heads around from behind different trees. And he didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him, and he was worried they were going to hurt him, but they didn't. And he said he was able to just keep walking, and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these animals that were watching him, and he just kept saying, they never hurt me. They never hurt me. And so obviously this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were looking to answer, and they just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock, and we can ask him at another time. But the theory became like, well, then he must have been abducted to have covered this distance. But that begs the question, who's capable of moving an 11-year-old that much distance in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window, moving potentially 50 plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around. And then even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, well, to what end? Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered to the swamp and then maneuvered to where he was found? It doesn't make any sense. One of the most remote places in the world is Buldir Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on Buldir Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Buldir Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Buldir Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily, and it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly they became very familiar with the whole island because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Buldir Island, so by now They know every square inch of the island. They're very comfortable here. They had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station. And after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there. And the weather at the time was very mild. You know, there's no snow on the ground. It's not very cold. It's not very windy. And the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain. But short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything, and they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what, he knows what he's doing. He's been here so long. He's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water. He's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island. They can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they're like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Bull Deer Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees. There was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder, let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. So someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. On August 2nd, 1963, 4-year-old Bobby Panknin, along with his 2 older brothers and his 2 parents, headed off to a camping resort on Deep Lake in Washington State. The following day, Mrs. Panknin, whose name was Edna, decides she wants to take her 3 sons down a logging road that was right behind their campsite that she had heard fed out to this beautiful little waterfall that she thought her sons would like to see. Edna gets the boys ready, she says bye to Mr. Panknin, and then she and her sons take off down this logging road. And as soon as she's on the road, it occurs to her that it's totally overgrown. The grass is really high, it's rocky and bumpy, and she's thinking to herself, there's no way any vehicle is getting down this road, and probably there's been no vehicles on this road for a very long time. This is a very isolated place on this campsite. So they walk for a little ways on this overgrown logging road until they see there's a turnoff that leads down to the water and this little waterfall. And so right away she saw there was all this brush they were going to need to walk through, and the ground looked pretty rough. And Bobby, her youngest, the 4-year-old, he didn't have shoes on. He was going through a phase where he refused to wear shoes, and so it hadn't really mattered the entire duration of walking up the road, but it seemed like this might be too much for him to walk on. And so she told Bobby to wait on the road, and she told her other son, Jimmy, the 6-year-old, to wait next to him. Those two would stay on the road together, while she and Bill, the 10-year-old, would go past the brush, go down to the water, check it out for a couple of minutes, and then she would come back, she would pick up Bobby, and Jimmy would come along, and then they would go down and look at the water, and then they would leave. Bobby didn't seem to mind, so he just sat on the road, and Jimmy was a little bit frustrated that he couldn't go with the first group, but he sat down too, and Bill and Edna took off past this brush down to the water. Now, the distance between where Bill and Edna and where Bobby and Jimmy were was only about 10 feet. There was just this brush right in the middle of them that did obscure their view. They could not see each other, but they are very close to each other. And so Jimmy is sitting next to Bobby, and he's getting increasingly more and more restless. He wants to go down and look at the waterfall. He wants to be down there with his older brother and his mom. And so at some point, he just can't take it anymore. And Jimmy does something that to this day, he regrets every single day. And that is he got up and left his brother. He went through the brush down to where Bill and Edna were. And as soon as Edna saw him, she was mad at him, and she goes, "What? You left Bobby up there? Come on." And so they turned around after about 60 seconds and went right back up. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. And at first, they're not like, oh my goodness, someone's abducted Bobby, because there's no one on this road. They'd come up here and recognize that it's very remote, it's isolated, there's no cars that come through here, they hadn't heard anything. And so their first instinct was, okay, he probably got up, and is behind a tree, or, he walked down the hill over here, or he's nearby. And so they're yelling for him, they're walking around, and no one's panicking yet. In fact, really, Edna was just annoyed with Jimmy that he had left, Bobby, and that he's to blame right now, but it's just an inconvenience at this point. But after a couple of minutes, when they can't get Bobby to yell back where he is, they start to realize they might have a problem here. And so Edna becomes more panicked, and she's yelling at the top of her lungs for her son. She's having her other 2 sons go look down by the water, go look over there, but there's no trace of him. And they can't believe it. It didn't make any sense because, he's 4, he's got no shoes on, they didn't hear anything. How could he be gone? But he was gone. And so finally, after a couple of minutes, Edna rounded up her other 2 boys, and they ran all the way back to the campsite where they got Mr. Panknin, and they hailed the police, and very quickly, a big search was launched up on that logging road. As soon as the police arrived, the first thing they did is they pressed Edna and the other 2 boys about, what did you hear? You had to have heard something. He was only 10 feet away from you, and he was within earshot of you, certainly. What did you hear? Did a vehicle come through? Did you hear an animal? Did you hear anybody talking? And Edna and the other 2 boys, they swore that they heard nothing, that they're just as baffled by it as anybody else. And so the police really didn't have a good starting point of where Bobby could have gone. And in that area, there wasn't any, steep drop-offs or obvious places that Bobby could have fallen into or gotten trapped. The water for the waterfall, it's not deep. It's this little tiny brook. It'd be difficult to drown in that little brook. So they just basically started fanning out in all directions, hoping they would, find a piece of clothing or some other clue that would indicate where he went. After 3 days of searching that yielded nothing, they finally brought in a bloodhound to try to find him based on scent. And so they had the dog smell one of Bobby's shoes, and the dog immediately seemed to key in on his scent in the area where Bobby had gone missing. And the dog turns and starts running up the logging road away from the campsite, so farther into the forest. And it runs for almost 2 miles, and it never seems to waver. It's clearly picked up Bobby's scent. And it stops at this fork in the road about 2 miles away from where Bobby had gone missing. And it keys in on this one area right at the fork where there wasn't anything significant. It was just this bare patch of dirt. And so the police, they uncover the dirt a little bit. There's nothing there. They're looking around the area. That there's no indication that Bobby was ever here. So they give the scent back to the dog. And again, the dog just keeps tracking to this one section in this fork in the road. But they didn't know what to do with that information because there was nothing there. The search for Bobby was called off after 7 days because they could not find anything. And so the lead investigator came out and did this press release where he basically said, "We have no idea what happened to Bobby. However, we do think he was abducted." And his reasoning for this was pretty straightforward. Bobby was a young kid that had no shoes on in an unfamiliar forest, and he was only out of eyesight for 2 minutes. So how far could he really have gotten? Certainly not far enough that his family wouldn't have found him after those 2 minutes were up and they began looking for him. And so if you go down the abduction rabbit hole, you start with, okay, a person must have taken Bobby. But for a person to take Bobby, that means a person had to be in this area that was super isolated and remote, and they hadn't seen anybody in the area, and there were very few campers at the campsite. So realistically, if a person was going to abduct Bobby, they had to have been planning it and had to have been hiding in the trees and were stalking this family until they got to that spot where Jimmy left Bobby, and then this person, runs out of the tree line, runs over to Bobby, picks him up without Bobby making a sound, he muffles him, and he runs away into the woods carrying this child, all in a 2-minute window, which was a totally abrupt window. It wasn't like this obvious thing that Bobby was going to be left alone. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which would have been a deterrent, you would think, if someone was trying to abduct Bobby. But nonetheless, this window presents itself and this person runs down and takes Bobby. It just seems like that person would need to be really fixated on Bobby, one, and there wasn't a clear reason for why anyone would be very fixated on Bobby or this family. And two, they would need to be very strong and quick and agile, more than the average person. So we're talking like a professional athlete level of agility and physical fitness. And so while it's certainly possible that a professional athlete had been stalking this family and then ran down in this tiny little window of time and stole Bobby away without getting detected and then evaded the law for 7 days in the middle of the woods, while that's possible, it's pretty unlikely. And investigators reached this conclusion. They thought, it does seem pretty unlikely that a person did this. So they moved on to animals and they said, okay, maybe a bear took Bobby. And so they brought out bear sniffing dogs to search the area for signs that a bear had been there. And there hadn't been. And so they said, okay, maybe a cougar had been there. And so they brought out a cougar expert who looked around the area, and there was no signs of a cougar in the area. Plus, there was no blood anywhere around the area where Bobby had been taken. There was no drag marks where if a predator were to grab you, they would need to drag you away. There was no drag marks. So it seemed like, okay, the large predator theory also has problems with it. And so the next theory offered up was, well, maybe a giant eagle swooped down and picked Bobby up and flew him away, which would account for why maybe it was quiet and there was no drag marks, there was no blood, and why he's just gone. But that was when authorities said, okay, we clearly have no clue. And so that's why they gave the press release and basically said, we just don't know. And so while we probably will never know what happened to Bobby, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent, it was fast, it was strong, it was agile, and it had been watching that family. Because as soon as that 2-minute window presented itself, where Jimmy was gone and Bobby was vulnerable, it swept in so fast that no one heard it, no one saw it, and it took Bobby somewhere and did something to him. And whatever it did, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going, when his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything. He said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight, and it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before, and so it makes sense he might be tired. But, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute, and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated, and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with the sun, and he puts the son down by a tree, and he sits down next to him, and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree, and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see, and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline. And he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is how? Because he couldn't walk until now. And my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree. He picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son. He's not hearing anything. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away.
Golden light spills through the haze. A sacred rhythm sets us ablaze. Every note a secret call. In these waves we lose it all. crystal clear. Through the rhythm we collide, bound by the sound, side by side. Seraphic waves, they lift us high. Through the clouds we touch the sky. In the flow we're free to soar, forever dancing, wanting more. Feel the whispers, they draw us near. A melody that's crystal clear. Through the rhythm we collide, bound by the sound, side.
In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they had thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves. That's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed, and two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this.